Laura Mitchell walked into the cinema expecting nothing more than a quiet night. But when Daniel Harris and Chloe Reed refused to stop talking during the film, a simple act of frustration turned into the spark of a tragedy that would leave an entire town shaken. The cinema was alive with the low hum of anticipation as people filed in, carrying buckets of popcorn and drinks that glowed faintly in the dim light. The smell of buttered popcorn lingered in the air, mixing with the faint scent of new carpet and air conditioning. It was a Saturday night, the busiest evening for the theater, and nearly every seat had been sold. Families gathered in groups, couples leaned close, and groups of friends chatted excitedly about the film they were about to see. The big screen flickered with trailers, flashes of color reflecting across the faces of the audience. Among them sat Laura Mitchell, a 32-year-old nurse who worked long hours at a nearby hospital. Movies were her escape, a ritual that allowed her to put aside the stress and exhaustion of her demanding job. She had chosen this film carefully, wanting something that would sweep her into another world and leave her thoughts far from the white walls and fluorescent lights of her daily routine. Laura sat in the middle rows, her favorite spot, close enough to be immersed in the sound, but far enough back to take in the full view. She carried no company but didn't mind the solitude. She opened a small pack of candy and let her shoulders sink into the seat. The previews rolled on, and for a while, everything seemed exactly as she had hoped. A quiet evening where she could disappear into the story unfolding in front of her. But just as the lights dimmed further, and the opening credits of the feature film began, the calm was disrupted. Behind her, a couple had been whispering through the previews, and now their voices grew more noticeable against the silence. At first, it was easy to dismiss, the kind of chatter people expect to fade once the real film starts. Laura ignored it, focusing on the sweeping sound of the score and the bright images filling the screen. But the couple's voices didn't stop. Their tone shifted between muffled laughter and louder commentary, punctuating the silence in a way that made it impossible not to notice. Laura wasn't the only one disturbed. People shifted uncomfortably in their seats, turning their heads briefly to signal irritation, but no one said a word. It was the sort of situation where everyone waited for someone else to handle it, and in that waiting, the disruption grew bolder. The woman's giggles became sharper, the man's remarks more careless, as if they knew they were breaking the unspoken rules and didn't care. Laura tried to concentrate on the movie, telling herself to let it go, but the frustration pressed against her patience. Her weeks were long and draining, filled with patients who leaned on her kindness and coworkers who demanded her focus. She had carved out this night as her own, and now two strangers were stealing it. She shifted in her seat, glancing briefly over her shoulder. The couple didn't notice, too wrapped in their own conversation. A flicker of unease ran through her chest, but she brushed it away. To her, it was nothing more than inconsiderate behavior, the kind she had encountered before in public places. She had no way of knowing that this irritation would soon spiral far beyond her expectations, turning what should have been a simple night at the movies into the beginning of something that would shake the entire town. Laura sank deeper into her seat, forcing herself to focus on the glowing screen, but the words behind her continued to break through like sharp static in the middle of a broadcast. The man's voice was low yet cutting, his words slipping into the silence with an edge of defiance. The woman's laughter followed, light and shrill, a sound that seemed intentionally loud in a room meant for quiet. The film's opening scenes carried tension and drama, but for Laura and the people seated nearby, the story unfolding on the screen was drowned out by the disruption. Some attendees shifted again, a few sighing audibly. But the couple's behavior only grew more brazen. It wasn't simple forgetfulness. It was almost as though they enjoyed being noticed. Laura's patience thinned. She adjusted her bag on her lap, her fingers tapping against the candy box as she debated what to do. For years, she had been the sort of person who avoided conflict, but her exhaustion left her less tolerant than usual. After working endless shifts and dealing with life-and-death decisions, she wanted a single evening of peace. The whispers and laughter gnawed at that desire until she finally leaned slightly forward and turned her head. Her eyes locked with theirs through the dim glow of the movie's light. For a brief second, silence reclaimed the row. The couple noticed her. The man stared back with a flicker of amusement, not embarrassment. His posture was relaxed, as if he didn't see her as a threat. The woman leaned closer to him, her smile crooked and smug. Laura held their gaze for a moment longer, her expression clear, then turned back to the screen. For a short while, it worked. The theater settled, the voices behind her vanishing into silence, and Laura let out a quiet breath of relief. But that peace was fragile. 10 minutes later, the sound returned. This time, the voices were quieter, more like whispers, but they carried just enough to remain intrusive. Every laugh, no matter how muted, pierced Laura's concentration. Around her, others exchanged glances, but no one spoke. The weight of being the only one to act pressed against her chest, making her feel exposed. What began as annoyance slowly shifted into unease. The couple's persistence seemed deliberate, a silent battle that had moved beyond casual rudeness into something more personal. As the movie unfolded, Laura found herself less engaged with the plot and more aware of the presence behind her. She could feel their eyes on the back of her head, a strange awareness that grew stronger each time they shifted or leaned closer together. It was no longer about noise. It was about tension. The room was filled with strangers, yet the atmosphere felt intimate, as though a silent conflict was developing between just 3 people in a crowd of dozens. By the time the film reached its midpoint, Laura's stomach twisted with a quiet dread she didn't want to acknowledge. She reminded herself it was only a movie theater, only a pair of inconsiderate people, but a voice deep inside whispered that something about this encounter was different. Something about it was dangerous. The credits rolled, filling the room with dramatic music as the story on screen came to an end. For most of the audience, the film had provided an evening of entertainment, but for Laura, it had been an exhausting test of patience. She gathered her bag slowly, letting the crowd begin to move before she stood. The glow of the exit signs painted faint red lines across the walls, guiding the audience out in an orderly stream. Laura joined the line, but her shoulders felt tight. She resisted the urge to glance back, though every instinct told her she was still being watched. In the lobby, the smell of popcorn lingered, mixing with the chatter of people discussing favorite scenes. Laura moved quickly, slipping past a group of teenagers and heading toward the glass doors. The couple was only a few steps behind her. Witnesses would later describe how unusual it seemed, the way they lingered so close to her path instead of slowing down or heading in another direction. The woman held onto the man's arm, but her eyes were fixed forward, unblinking and cold. The man's movements were casual, almost careless, yet too deliberate to be ignored. Outside, the air was cooler, carrying the faint sound of traffic from the street beyond the parking lot. The night sky was clear, stars faintly visible above the glow of the theater lights. People spilled into the lot in clusters, laughing, unlocking their cars and saying their goodbyes. To anyone else, it was an ordinary Saturday night. But for Laura, each step felt heavier than the last. She kept her pace steady, pretending not to notice the presence behind her. She hoped that once she reached her car, the unease would fade. The parking lot stretched wide, rows of vehicles lined neatly under dim lamps. Shadows gathered between them, pockets of darkness where movement could easily hide. Laura's car was parked near the far end, where the lights flickered weakly. She gripped her keys tighter, her thumb brushing over the small panic button on the fob. She told herself not to overreact, not to let her imagination twist the situation into something it wasn't. After all, she reminded herself, they were just another couple leaving the theater like everyone else. Yet, as she approached her car, the sound of footsteps behind her grew clearer, more purposeful. The couple had not broken away, not chosen a different path. They were still there, their presence undeniable now. Laura slowed briefly, then quickened her pace, her pulse beginning to race. She could feel their focus, as though she had somehow become the center of their evening. Near the theater entrance, a security guard leaned against a wall, speaking into a radio. He didn't notice Laura, and she didn't call out. The thought crossed her mind, but was dismissed just as quickly. She didn't want to appear paranoid. She only wanted to get into her car and drive home. The decision to remain silent in that moment would become one of the most haunting details of the night. The kind of choice that seemed small until it was too late to change. Laura reached her car, the metal of the door handle cold beneath her trembling fingers. She fumbled with the key fob, her breath quickening as the sharp echo of footsteps pressed closer. In the reflection of her car window, she caught a faint blur of movement, two figures closing the distance with unsettling precision. Her heart pounded as she dropped her keys, the sound of them hitting the asphalt impossibly loud in the stillness of the lot. She bent quickly to retrieve them, and in that brief moment, the world changed. The man's shadow loomed larger, and when Laura straightened, he had already slipped a gun from the backpack slung across his shoulder. The sight of it was jarring in the dim light, the steel catching the glow of the nearest lamp. Time seemed to pause for a second, as if the night itself was holding its breath. Laura's own reflection in the car window looked back at her, wide-eyed and terrified, a silent warning she could not heed. Then the sound broke, sharp, violent, unmistakable. The gun fired once, and the crack tore through the air like lightning splitting the sky. The echo bounced between the rows of vehicles, startling birds from a nearby tree and freezing the movements of everyone still leaving the theater. Screams erupted seconds later, piercing the calm night as people realized what had happened. Laura collapsed against the side of her car, her keys scattering across the ground once more. The shot had struck her chest, and her body gave way, sliding down until she lay motionless on the pavement. A dark stain spread beneath her, illuminated by the flickering glow of the overhead lamp. The candy she had saved from the movie rolled from her bag, resting beside her lifeless hand, an almost surreal reminder of how ordinary the evening was supposed to have been. Chaos spread instantly. Families shouted to one another, rushing their children toward safety. Strangers ducked behind cars, unsure if more shots would follow. The security guard near the entrance drew his radio, his voice urgent as he called for backup and medical assistance. Within moments, sirens in the distance began to wail, their approach adding to the frantic energy consuming the lot. The couple wasted no time. They bolted, the woman clutching the man's arm as they disappeared between rows of cars, their dark silhouettes swallowed by the night. Witnesses caught only fragments, a jacket flapping, shoes pounding against asphalt, the faint echo of hurried breaths. By the time anyone gathered the courage to chase, they were gone. Laura's body remained at the scene, surrounded by broken whispers and horrified gasps. Some strangers knelt nearby, trying to help despite knowing the wound was too severe. Others stood frozen, unable to process the violence they had just witnessed. What should have been a simple night at the movies was now a crime scene, a place of panic and tragedy under the watchful glow of theater lights. The sound of that single gunshot lingered in the air long after the couple vanished, a chilling reminder that danger can strike in the most ordinary of places. Detectives arrived swiftly, their unmarked cars pulling into the cordoned-off lot, where flashing lights painted the night in red and blue. Yellow tape stretched across the area as officers directed onlookers away, while paramedics confirmed what witnesses already feared. Laura Mitchell was gone. Her body was carefully covered, but the image of her final moments clung to everyone who had been there. For the investigators, the challenge was immediate, a senseless act of violence committed in a public place, with dozens of possible witnesses and a pair of suspects who had vanished without a trace. Surveillance footage from the theater became the first crucial lead, Grainy images showed Laura entering the cinema alone, purchasing her ticket, and moving toward her seat. Minutes later, the couple appeared on camera, a man in a dark hoodie carrying a backpack, and a woman with strikingly long hair tied back in a braid. Their faces were partially obscured, but their posture and movements matched multiple witness accounts. Another camera caught them trailing Laura into the parking lot, sealing them as the prime suspects. What shocked investigators most, however, was how calm they looked, as though the act had been premeditated rather than spontaneous. As detectives pieced together the evidence, a disturbing pattern began to surface. The couple had been seen before. Several patrons from previous weeks reported similar behavior: loud talking, disruptive actions, even aggressive stares when confronted. None of those incidents had escalated, but it painted a portrait of people who sought conflict, testing boundaries until they found someone who pushed back. Laura had become that person, and it had cost her everything. Days passed without a breakthrough, frustration mounting as the trail grew colder. Then came the discovery that shifted the case entirely. A discarded firearm was found in a dumpster less than a mile from the theater. Wrapped in a piece of fabric stained with blood, it matched the caliber used in Laura's killing. Forensic testing revealed the man's fingerprints, but alongside his DNA was something unexpected: the presence of a third individual. This clue complicated everything, suggesting that the couple had not been acting alone. Somewhere in the crowded theater that night, a silent accomplice had blended into the background, unseen and unsuspected. The revelation unsettled the community. Rumors spread quickly, theories about why the shooting had taken place and what connection, if any, the accomplice might have had. Was it a thrill gone too far, a calculated act meant to prove loyalty, or something darker tied to crimes beyond that night? Investigators remained cautious, sharing little publicly. But behind the scenes, the case grew wider than anyone had imagined. For the people who had sat in the dark theater that evening, the memory of Laura's quiet figure in the middle rows lingered like a shadow. She had asked only for silence, an ordinary request in an ordinary place. Yet that small act had set off a chain of violence and mystery that revealed just how unpredictable human behavior can be. The unanswered questions about the accomplice and the motives behind the crime ensured that Laura Mitchell's U.S. story would remain a haunting reminder of how quickly the ordinary can turn into the unthinkable.